The morning Roy Calvert buried the plow, the sky was the color of a paper bag, and the wheat had been dead for 3 weeks. His son Eldon was 12 years old. He stood at the edge of the field with a feed sack over his shoulders against the wind and watched his father work the ground with a spade. Not to plant, not to turn, but to dig a hole big enough for the plow's blade and beam. The soil came up in dry, pale chunks, nothing like the black loam that had given them 200 bushels to the acre in '29. Eldon did not ask what his father was doing. He had learned that summer that some things his father did were not for questions. Roy Calvert was 43 years old. His hands were the color of the field, cracked, dry, the skin pulled tight over the knuckles from years of cold mornings and hot afternoons, and the kind of work that does not stop because you are tired. He had farmed this ground in Meade County, Kansas, since 1915. His father had farmed the same ground before him. The plow, a John Deere walking plow with a 14-inch moldboard and a handle worn smooth from 30 years of palms, had come with the land. Roy had never once considered selling it. He considered it that morning for about the length of time it takes to walk from the barn to the field edge. Then he picked up the spade. He buried the plow the day the wheat died. His son dug it up 40 years later in the same field. The years before the dust came were not easy, but they were legible. You planted in September. You waited. You harvested in June if the rain came right. Roy had seen dry years before, 1917, 1924, years when the yield came in thin and the bank had to be patient. But the rain had always come back. He had no reason to believe it would not come back again. A man who farms the same ground his father farmed does not easily imagine that the ground itself can turn against him. His wife Clara made biscuits every morning. That is not a small thing to say about a woman in 1934. It meant flour in the bin, lard in the tin, the stove drawing right. She made them in a cast-iron pan her mother had given her the morning she married Roy in the autumn of 1914. 20 years of biscuits. The pan was black and smooth and weighed more than Eldon had when he was born. Clara kept it on the back left burner always, ready. When things got hard, she made more of them, not fewer, as if the act of feeding her family was itself an argument against despair. Eldon had grown up between the two of them, the way a fence post grows between two fields. Straight, holding the boundary, necessary. He helped his father from the time he could carry a pail. By 10, he could harness the mule, a gray Missouri mule named Frank who was older than Eldon and considerably more opinionated, and work a straight furrow without being told twice. Roy watched his son work and said little. Saying little was Roy's way of saying he approved. Frank was the best thing on the farm when the dust came. He could smell a storm an hour before it hit, and he would not stop moving his head until someone opened the barn and let him in. Roy learned to watch the mule the way sailors watch the sky. When Frank started in with his head, Roy set down whatever he was doing and went to find Clara and Eldon. They were never caught outside in a bad one because of that mule. The first bad storm came in the spring of 1933. Roy had seen the sky go brown before. There had been a black roller in '26 that took shingles off the barn roof, but nothing like this. The sky went brown at 10 in the morning and black by noon, and the dust hit the side of the house like a wave hitting a pier, a sound like the whole world had turned to sand and was moving sideways. Roy sat with his back against the barn door from inside and felt the whole structure shudder against him. Clara wet strips of old sheet and stuffed them under the door frames. Eldon sat at the kitchen table with a wet cloth over his face and did a page of arithmetic by lamplight. The lamp at noon, the windows black, because Clara had told him school did not stop for the weather, and she meant it. When the storm passed, 2 inches of fine brown dust covered every surface in the house. The wheat field was half gone. The other half fell over the next 2 weeks. Roy walked his field the morning after that first storm and did not come back until supper. Clara kept the biscuits warm. When he came in, he sat down and ate, and said the East 40 might come back if the wind let up by June. It did not let up by June. The East 40 did not come back. By the spring of 1935, they had sold the second mule. They had kept Frank, sold the chicken flock down to 6 hens, sold Roy's father's watch, sold the extra harness and 2 good saddles. The bank in Mead City had been patient the first year, and civil the second, and businesslike the third. Roy had nothing left to show the bank that was worth discussing. The man who came to talk about the plow was named Hessler. He drove out from Liberal in a truck that was newer than anything on the Calvert farm, and he wore a hat that had not been in a field. He told Roy he could get $18 for the John Deere plow. He said other farmers in the county were doing it. He said there was no shame in it. Roy looked at him for a moment. Then he said he would think on it. Hessler left his card on the porch rail. Roy did not pick up the card. The wind took it that same afternoon. The next morning he went out to the barn before sunrise. He hitched Frank to the plow, the last time, though he did not say that out loud, and drove it to the far southeast corner of the East 40, where the ground dipped slightly and stayed moister than the rest. He unhitched Frank, tied him to the fence post, and began to dig. He made the hole 4 feet deep and 3 feet wide. It took most of the morning. The plow went in blade first, wrapped in a piece of oil-soaked burlap Clara had cut from a grain sack. Roy filled the hole in layers, tamping each one down with the flat of the spade. He set a flat piece of limestone on top, not as a marker, just a stone, and stood back. Frank watched with his ears forward. He buried the plow the day the wheat died. His son dug it up 40 years later in the same field. Eldon had watched from the fence line. When his father was done and turned back toward the barn, Eldon fell in beside him, and they walked together without speaking. After a while, Eldon said, "Are we leaving?" Roy said he did not know yet. Eldon said, "Frank cannot fit in a car." Roy looked at his son. He said, "No, he cannot." That settled something. Roy did not say what. They did not leave in the spring of 1935. Some things the dust could not bury. 3 families on their road left. The Prathers in March, the Holloways in April, the Dunbar family in June, with everything in a Model A that bottomed out on the county road and had to be pushed the first half mile by Roy and Eldon and old Mr. Peabody from the next section, who was too old to leave and knew it. Roy helped push and then watched the car crest the hill and disappear, and stood in the road for a moment before turning back. Clara made biscuits the next morning and the morning after that. What kept them was not stubbornness alone, though Roy had enough of that for 2 men. It was something more particular. He had watched his father plant the East 40 for the first time in 1912, the year Roy was 20. He had stood at the field edge the morning his father turned the first furrow, and watched the black soil come up clean and smelling of everything that had been growing in it since before anyone could remember. His father had said nothing memorable, just work the ground. But Roy had understood that morning that there was a difference between a man who works land and a man who belongs to it. His father belonged to this ground. Roy belonged to it. He did not know yet whether Eldon would, but he was not going to take that possibility away from his son by leaving before the rain came back. The relief checks started coming in 35. Roy took them without comment and without gratitude, which was his way of taking anything he had not earned himself. Clara spent them carefully. Flour first, salt pork, kerosene, whatever the school needed from Eldon. What was left she put in the coffee tin above the stove. She did not count it in front of Roy. If this story is finding you at the right moment, there are more where it came from. Subscribe so the next one reaches you too. Eldon finished 8th grade in the spring of 36 and started working the road crew with the county that summer. $2 a day, 4 days a week, hauling fill for the erosion barriers the government men were putting in along the creek beds. He gave his mother $1.60 of every day's pay and kept 40 cents. Clara put his $1.60 in the coffee tin. She did not tell Roy the tin was for Eldon. Roy knew. Frank died in the summer of 1937. He went down in the barn on a Tuesday morning, and Roy sat with him for 3 hours before he died. Clara brought Roy a cup of coffee at some point, and set it on the ground beside him, and went back to the house. Roy did not drink the coffee. He sat with his hand on the mule's neck until it was over, and then he stood up and went and told Eldon. Eldon was 15. He went to the barn alone and stayed for a while, and came back without saying anything, and ate supper and went to bed. Roy did not buy another mule. He borrowed a neighbor's tractor for the next 2 planting seasons and said nothing about what that cost him. The rain came back in the spring of 1939. Not all at once. Nothing about the return of rain is dramatic if you have been waiting long enough, if you have spent 4 years watching the sky for something it refused to give. It came in increments, enough to green the short grass in the low draws first, then enough to dampen the top inch of soil without blowing off, then enough to stay 2 inches down where the roots could find it. Roy stood in the East 41 morning, in April, and pressed 2 fingers into the ground and brought them up dark. He looked at his fingers for a long moment. He looked at the field. He looked at the sky, pale blue and high and still, the kind of April sky that does not promise rain, and does not need to, because the rain has already done its work in the night. He went in and told Clara the ground was ready. She made biscuits that morning, same as any other morning. But when she set the pan on the table, she put her hand on Roy's arm for a moment before she sat down. She did not say anything. Roy covered her hand with his, and they sat like that for the length of a breath. Eldon looked at his plate and ate his biscuits, and did not remark on it, because some things between parents are not for children to name, even when the children are nearly grown. Roy planted winter wheat in the fall of 39. The yield in June of 40 came in at 68 bushels to the acre, not the 200 of 29, but enough. Enough to make the bank payment, enough to put something in the coffee tin that was not from the government, enough for Roy to start thinking about what else needed doing on the East 40, and whether it made sense to think about a second tractor. Eldon joined the army in the spring of 42. He was 19 years old. Clara packed his bag and did not cry until he was down the road far enough that he would not see her in the rear view. Roy drove him to the bus station in Mead City, and they sat in the truck for a minute before Eldon got out. Roy said, "The East 40 will be here when you get back." Eldon said, "I know it." Roy said, "So will I." Eldon nodded and got out and picked up his bag and walked into the station without looking back, which was his way, Roy's way, Clara's way, of saying the things that did not have words. Roy farmed alone through the war years with a hired man 2 days a week named Polk, who was 60 and slow but steady. Clara took Polk's lunch out to the field at noon every day, and sometimes stayed to watch them work for a few minutes before going back. The East 40 came in at 80 bushels in 43 and 91 in 44, and Roy began to think he had not been wrong to stay. Eldon came home in November of 45. He was thin and quiet, in a way that was different from his old quiet. Quieter in the eyes, the way men get who have seen things they did not choose to see and have decided not to pass them on. He ate Clara's biscuits and slept 11 hours the first night, and the next morning came out to the field with Roy without being asked. He did not say he was ready. He just put on his boots and came out. They worked side by side through the morning, and Roy did not ask about the war, and Eldon did not tell him, and by the end of the day, something had settled back into place that had been loose since 42. That evening, Eldon said, "I thought about this field sometimes." Roy said, "The wheat thought about you too." Eldon almost smiled. Clara set the biscuit pan on the table, and they ate supper in the kitchen, with the window open and the smell of the turned earth coming in on the evening air. Eldon married a woman named Ruth in the spring of 48. She was from a farm family in Comanche County, and she knew how to read the sky and she made a pie that Roy said was nearly as good as Clara's biscuits, which was the highest compliment he had given anything that was not the East 40. Roy built them a second room on the back of the house, and did not accept help doing it, because the work was the gift. Clara died in 1953, a Tuesday in February, quietly, in the bed she had shared with Roy since 1914. The cast iron pan stayed on the back left burner. Eldon's wife Ruth used it without being told it should stay there. Some objects teach people where they belong. Roy farmed for 6 more years after Clara. He worked the East 40 with Eldon beside him, and did not slow down appreciably until his 68th year, when his back made it a conversation. He died in November of 1961, in the chair beside the kitchen window that looked out on the East 40, on a dry afternoon, with the winter wheat coming up green in the low rows. He had said at breakfast that the stand looked good. Those were the last words anyone heard him say about farming, which was the same as saying they were his last words about everything that mattered. Eldon farmed the Calvert ground for the next 14 years. He and Ruth had 2 sons, Carl, born in 49, and Roy, named for his grandfather, born in 51. Both boys worked the farm from the time they could carry a pail. Eldon said little when they worked well, and said less when they did not. His father's way. In the spring of 1975, Eldon Calvert was 53 years old. He was working the southeast corner of the East 40 with a new disc harrow, running shallow passes to break the winter crust before planting, when the right side disc struck something hard 8 inches down. Not a rock. The ground in that corner ran deep and clean. He stopped the tractor and got down and took the long-handled probe from the toolbox and pushed it into the soil. It struck metal. He went back to the barn and got a spade. His son Carl was working the north field. Eldon did not call him over. He dug alone, the way his father had dug alone on a dry morning in 1935, though Eldon did not know yet that this was the same hole his father had made. He dug down 2 feet, then 3. At just over 4 feet, the spade hit something wrapped in rotted burlap that fell away in damp strips as he worked around it. He cleared the soil from the sides and worked his hands under the object and lifted. A John Deere walking plow, 14-inch moldboard, handle worn smooth as glass from 30 years of palms. The blade had rusted, but the beam was sound. The wood of the handle had dried and cracked but held. It was the same plow. Eldon knew it before he had it fully out of the ground. He had harnessed Frank to it when he was 10 years old. He knew the weight of it the way you know a thing that has been in your hands since before you were strong enough to hold it well. He sat on the edge of the hole with the plow across his knees for a long time. The afternoon was quiet, no wind, which was not always the case on the Kansas plain even in spring, and the absence of it felt deliberate, like the land holding its breath. A meadowlark called from the fence line on the north side, and called again, and then stopped. The winter wheat in the East 40 was 6 inches high and running straight in rows. His father had first laid out in 1915. The sky was the same Kansas sky it had always been. High, pale blue in spring, going gold at the edges toward evening. Not a paper bag, not dust. Blue. He buried the plow the day the wheat died. His son dug it up 40 years later in the same field. Eldon understood now what his father had been saying with the plow. Not, I will come back for it. Not, I am saving it from the sale. What Roy Calvert had said with that hole and that burlap and that limestone marker was something simpler and harder than either of those. He had said, the ground will be worth farming again. He had said it by burying the thing that farming required. He had said, I am not leaving this here as a relic. I am leaving it here as a promise. Eldon carried the plow to the barn. He cleaned the blade with an oil rag and set it against the east wall where the light came in through the gap in the siding in the afternoon. Then he went to the house and called his son Carl in from the north field and told him what he had found. Carl came in and looked at the plow for a long time without speaking. Then he said, Grandpa buried it. Eldon said, yes. Carl said, because he knew he was coming back. Eldon looked at his son. He said, because he knew the ground was coming back. It is not the same thing. Carl thought about that for a while. Then he said he understood. Eldon believed him. The plow stands in the barn on the Calvert farm in Meade County, Kansas, against the east wall, in the afternoon light. Eldon's grandson James farms the ground now, the east 40, and the north section, and 2 additional quarters he bought in 2008, when the neighbor retired. He runs a GPS-guided planter and a combine with an air-conditioned cab and a yield monitor that maps the field in real time. He does not need a 14-inch walking plow for anything. He has not moved it from the wall. There is a thing that happens when you farm ground your great-grandfather broke. You do not own it exactly. You hold it. You are part of a long agreement between the people who came before you and the people who will come after you. And the ground itself is the document. James Calvert understands this, the way you understand anything that was never explained to you. In the body, in the early morning before the light comes, when you are standing at the field edge in the same place where Roy Calvert stood in 1935, looking at soil that would not grow, and deciding anyway to stay. Some things the dust could not bury. A new story arrives every day. If you would like to be here when the next one does, subscribe. We will see you then.